Alright, this is a fun one because it involves a lot of speculation. There's not any concrete news or announcements of any kind. It's purely just leaks, like renders and mock-ups, primarily coming from Walter Isaacson, who has just done and is about to release this huge biography about Elon Musk. And in doing these interviews, as well as people posting a few pictures from the book, we've seen this incredibly cool Tesla concept image of what potentially could be a Robotaxi, and apparently this was a photo from Tesla that existed around 2022, so don't try to look too hard into all of the details in this. These are likely mock-ups, things that Franz and Elon are toying around with, as well as this cardboard mock-up, which definitely shows, in my opinion, a little bit of wheel location tweaking, but it's kind of up in the air right now on Twitter between people trying to decide, is this a four-wheeler vehicle or is this a three-wheeler vehicle? In my opinion, the picture straight from the book definitely looks like a three-wheeler, but there's these tiny renders off to the side of the cardboard mock-up that make it look more like it is a four-wheeler. It's just the back tires are a bit more close to the center of gravity. There's other vehicles that have done this in the past where you kind of keep the rear axle shorter and try to make a more aerodynamic shape, but the overarching similarity between these Robotaxi concepts is the idea of having one row of seats. In the cardboard cutout that Franz is showcasing, in fact, they're actually using the three-seat bench row style second row that you would see in the Model 3 and Model Y, which points to the idea, whether or not it's a three-wheeler or a four-wheeler, that the Robotaxi could sit a maximum of 3 people, but definitely be a heck of a lot smaller than a Model 3, and I assume this would enable them to manufacture it for much, much cheaper than what they're currently building sedans and crossovers with. Like, this would be the accumulation of everything Tesla has learned put together, which I'm sure involves single-piece castings, and of course, this would be on the next generation vehicle platform like they've talked about, so the 1000 volt architecture and the 48 volt low voltage architecture so that they can use thinner wiring, you know, they don't have to push as many amps, and of course their next generation powertrain, which uses 0 rare earth materials. And in my opinion, this would make a lot of sense to be Tesla's first front wheel drive vehicle, where you could just have one motor in the front. If it is a three-wheeler, I don't think it would necessarily be ideal for one motor to be in the back. And there's a lot of speculation and opinions being thrown around about how this is ugly, or why would Tesla make a Robotaxi sit only 2 to 3 people? What's the thought process here? And while I've expressed my doubts about Robotaxis being possible with all the varieties of human driving behavior and all of the local maximums that we could hit with the full self-driving computer and cameras and vision, I am willing to just push all of my doubts about FSD to the side for a second and just entertain the idea that, okay, what if we had full self-driving technology and it's level 5 and it's super safe and it's all great and all that? In my opinion, this vehicle design is genius. Like, I really hope it ends up being real. You know, Elon was referencing people quoting from the book that no, while it's not necessarily Cybertruck inspired, it will definitely look like the future. That gets me excited because I'm all in favor of more efficient designs, more affordable designs, and of course designs that push the status quo and make us question, why do we need vehicles to look the way they have always looked? That's the same kind of mindset that brought the Cybertruck into existence and the Aptera. And in the case of this vehicle, to me, focusing so much on aerodynamics and just having 2 to 3 seats actually makes a lot of sense. There's a ton of evidence that if you're taking an Uber or a Lyft, the vast majority of those rides tend to involve just 1 to 2 people, maybe 3, but we've also learned from companies like Aptera that have doubled down on these statistics that the vast majority of vehicles on the road typically have less than 2 people in them. So again, this is not necessarily a robo bus, this is not a robo van, it is a robo taxi, okay? This vehicle is catered towards people that could just be at their house or at their apartment, and they don't necessarily want to travel to some bus stop. This is meant to just come to wherever you are, and maybe it's just you and a friend, or you and your wife, and you're just like, hey, we just need a ride home real quick. You hail the Robotaxi, and boom, it shows up, and it just transfers 1 to 3 people at a time in the most efficient way possible, which if you're doing more low passenger drives, having this kind of vehicle is absolutely far more efficient than a robo van or a robo bus. Vans and buses only technically become more efficient once they are full at max capacity. Yes, they have a maximum seating occupancy of, could be 10, it could be 20 people, depending on if it's a van or a bus. And yes, if you're moving 20 or 30 people on one vehicle, that's going to be far more efficient than moving each of them individually with a car. But the key with robotaxis is we can't always ensure that buses and vans are constantly driving around at max capacity. electricity. That's not always a viable option depending on the region or depending on where people are driving to. You know, it's not like everybody at your work lives right next to you. And also sometimes we drive places that are not just work. We want to take a ride to the movie theater or the tennis courts or the grocery store, and it could be at varying times of day, or it could be different grocery stores depending on which you prefer. So because people like having that flexibility and freedom, if Tesla was to make a Robo Taxi of sorts that is mostly being compared to an Uber or a Lyft, in my opinion, this is genius. Like, it's super aerodynamic looking, at least from what we can see. It's not a very large vehicle, and if you had less wheels, that typically results in less rolling resistance and less weight, which in return could mean a much smaller battery pack. So with a design like this, I honestly feel like Tesla could probably get away with a 40, maybe 35 kilowatt hour battery pack, and because of its extreme aerodynamics and low weight, that would be enough battery to basically cover the vehicle's driving for most of the day. And the lower the weight, the cheaper it is to build that vehicle. So while a lot of people were very skeptical and very annoyed with, ew, what the heck is this? I was over the moon. Like, I think this is cool, and even if robo-taxis don't happen, and maybe this is a design or a rendering that Tesla plans on using for making the $25,000 car, you know, a vehicle they can actually sell, a vehicle that would have a steering wheel and pedals, I would still be super duper interested in this. Like, I genuinely hope one day Tesla ends up manufacturing a vehicle like this, because yes, the functionality may be limited by the lack of second row seats, and sure, the federal tax credit might not apply if it's a three-wheeler, or technically it's not even a sedan, so that might disqualify them from certain incentives, but I don't really care about making vehicles artificially cheaper, because I know that inherently isn't going to last with time. We're going to have different presidents and different administrations in charge of federal tax credits, and state incentives are all varying and changing all the time. Whereas if you can just inherently design a vehicle that is simple and is not complicated and that can scale up in production at very, very high volume, you don't have to worry about whether or not it qualifies for XYZ tax credit or whether or not you're in Colorado and can access all of these great incentives. There's just a vehicle that just straight up out the door, no questions, doesn't cost very much to build, which means doesn't cost very much for the person to buy. That's exciting to me. Like, I get really, really pumped about those ideas, and I don't care if it's not going to be as popular as a Model Y, because in America, we love our pickup trucks and SUVs, but to me, this is far more interesting and far more compelling and exciting than Tesla just making a compact car. Like, that's what it seems like everybody's more interested in. Like, oh yeah, they're just gonna make a 5-seater that's just a little bit shorter on the front and back. Like, we've seen that before, and compact cars typically don't result in a huge win in aerodynamics because they're so short and stubby. That creates a lot of additional drag, whereas this kind of design, which, you know, I had to bring it up at some point, definitely feels Aptera inspired, which Aptera's been working on their vehicle design for years. Even before they went under originally, they had a pretty similar looking design, which discovered that having a huge emphasis on that teardrop shape and having a three-wheel design resulted in far less energy consumption than really anything you could come up with four wheels. And there's certainly been a lot of discussion online about that now as well. It's like, well, if Tesla made a vehicle like this, Aptera would be dead, right? They'd have no chance at succeeding. And I personally disagree. You know, if you look on the US roads right now, there are a bunch of different brands, a bunch of different trucks and SUVs that all basically do the same thing, but there's little differences between the trucks and SUVs that pull each customer one direction over the other. Some of it could be brand loyalty, some of it could be brand stigma, like, I don't care how good that truck is, if it's from blank company, then I'm not buying it. And honestly, I could still foresee a ton of differences between this hypothetical Tesla three-wheeler and the Aptera. For one, Aptera is likely going to be prioritizing, even with their launch edition, much higher range figures. Like, most people ordering the Aptera were opting for the 400 plus mile range variant, and then after that, there's a ton of popularity between the 600 and 1000 mile range variants. Also, Aptera seems a lot more interested in doing solar, whereas Elon, time and time again, has expressed that solar doesn't make much sense on electric vehicles, and none of these concepts appear to be very solar emphasized. And also because the wheels are mounted inward, unlike the wheel pants on the Aptera, which are mounted on the outside, this design doesn't allow for that much storage space, especially like on the mock-up that Franz was showcasing to Walter, that, you know, it tapers off the back, which is good for aero, but it results in fairly little space for suitcases and storage and that kind of thing, whereas the Aptera has 32 cubic feet in the back, which is more space than the Model 3 trunk. And there's a huge differences between company ethos. Like, Aptera has a huge emphasis on right to repair and trying to make sure their vehicle is super duper easy to work on for the everyday person, whereas Tesla, we kind of know where they stand on repairability. There's not a huge emphasis to right to repair. Tesla's just like, we need to crank out as many vehicles as possible at high volume, which means we need every single part for ourselves, and you can't have any of our parts, and if you want service on your Tesla, you gotta go through us. And also huge differences when it comes to software. Like, Aptera seems to be very compelled and is promising that they're gonna have Apple CarPlay and Android Auto support, which to a lot of people is a huge deal. Like, if you ask a lot of Tesla forums what's the most common requested feature in their car, usually in the top 3 or top 5 for most people is CarPlay and Android Auto, which Tesla has time and time again said they're not interested in adding, and there's a good chance Tesla will never support that. But Aptera hasn't even started deliveries yet, and they are still on the record for saying, yes, we're working with Apple's software teams right now, and we're trying to make sure that our vehicle can support CarPlay. So I feel like Aptera is a lot less vertically integrated, but there's some benefits to that, and they're a lot more open source, you know, integrating OpenPilot, whereas Tesla is always like, we're gonna do everything ourselves, and you can't work on the car, and you don't need solar, and you don't need a higher range vehicle. I'm pretty sure if Tesla was gonna end up building vehicles like this in the future, that it would probably be lithium iron phosphate only. I don't think there would be that many different varying battery pack sizes. I think this vehicle platform is definitely just gonna be focused on scale, which means keep it simple, and if it's anything like the pictures and renderings that we've been seeing, I think there's a decent chance that the exterior could be completely steel, like the Cybertruck, or they could go the Aptera route, as it seems like they're already taking a lot of inspiration, and make it out of forged carbon, you know, like composites that don't need paint and that can take a beating and of course stay durable. Both the Aptera and this vehicle design, in my opinion, there's ways to design them to be safe and secure. I think there's a lot of propaganda that is convincing everyday people in America that the only way to have a safe vehicle is to have like a Hummer. You know, you gotta be in the largest possible vehicle, and that means safety, and if there's any vehicle that's small, that means it's dangerous. When in reality, just by looking at this concept, which I love the butterfly door design, by the way, that's so amazing, but I can still tell, similar to a Model 3, there's a huge crumple zone, and they've got a decent amount of crumple in the back as well if it got rear-ended, and I'm sure they would have state-of-the-art airbag systems and of course active safety systems to make sure that the vehicle doesn't crash and doesn't collide with anything else on the road. And the gears in my head basically just keep on turning. Like, I love the bench seat design so that you could fit 3 people in like a 3-wheeled vehicle or just a very, very small vehicle. I think that might only work if you're designing a Robotaxi though, because that's part of the reason the Cybertruck, by the way, ended up scrapping the 6th seater. Like, you don't have that middle seat anymore. It's because of that giant display in the front is not good for passenger safety in the event of a collision. It's just not a good place to try to design airbags. But with this, if there's no display in the car, which is in my opinion totally something Tesla would do, if you designed a Robotaxi that was capable of just showing up and driving you where you needed to go, why do you need that full self-driving visualization? That would be pointless, right? You can just manage the car, the payments, the directions, the destinations, all of that you could just do from your phone. It would just be an app and you would say, I want to go here. Even in mid-drive, you could probably change directions and then the car would go somewhere else. And also for cost cutting, of course. In the potential future where maybe Tesla figures out how to design a level 5 Robotaxi, you're basically removing the most expensive part from an Uber or a Lyft, which is the driver. And after that, then it becomes a game of how expensive is the vehicle, and of course, how expensive does it cost to run, which is why there would be, in my opinion, such a huge emphasis on aerodynamics and efficiency, because that would be how you undercut and how to get the cost per mile absurdly low so that these vehicles could be cheaper than any taxi service any Uber could ever dream of being. And that's ultimately Tesla's main reason for being so obsessed with autonomy and robotaxis, is the concept that these vehicles are going to be so cheap to ride around in. And of course that comes from the vehicle being cheap to produce and also very efficient on the road. And in their perfect world, this vehicle would be so cheap to ride around in that it wouldn't even make sense to own a vehicle anymore. And then one of these vehicles could start replacing the job of 4 to 5 cars on the road, because people would just be like, no, I'm not going to buy my own car. It's so cheap to just ride around in one of these things. But of course, as I'm sure many of you have already commented, there's flaws with that premise, which I've documented on this channel as well. You know, like if you're a family of 4 or a family of 5, don't you want to own your own vehicle that is the way you want it and has more storage space for those Costco runs and has your own car seats built into them? Or are you going to be the kind of family that's like, yeah, me and my wife will take one Robotaxi, but if the kids want to go, yeah, we'll just have to hail a second Robotaxi. Maybe these things will be so cheap that you can just put the kids in one car and then mom and dad can kind of relax and have a break in their own special vehicle. I guess it depends how much you trust your kids, right? If they start fighting and you can't do anything about it, maybe that's a little bit stressful. But maybe the parents just wanted a break anyway, so now they look forward to going everywhere with 2 autonomous little Robotaxis, which, if if they get the miles per kilowatt hour really, really high on this thing, like Aptera levels of aerodynamics and weight savings, in that case, then yeah, driving 2 of these, if they were around the same as the Aptera, like 100 watt hours per mile, that would still probably use less energy than taking one sedan, like a Model 3, which is going to have the energy consumption probably closer to 240 or 250 watt hours per mile. But this is all great scenarios for me. The Robotaxi potential is really, really exciting to me because, for one, it's just a futuristic looking car, and getting the cost down of manufacturing is really, really important for that Robotaxi model to make sense. But even if you don't believe in the Robotaxi future and you're more skeptical like I am, this would be a very, very cool and exciting vehicle for Tesla to build for the masses to sell at a $25,000 price. In fact, if they take out a lot of those bells and whistles, you know, maybe it doesn't have the vegan leather seats and it just goes with a cloth seat, or it has a pretty small center display that's just for basic navigation. Honestly, this kind of design has got the gears turning. I'm like, yeah, they could probably go under $25,000 if they made a 2-door, you know, 2-seater type vehicle, which sure probably wouldn't sell as well as a Model Y or a Cybertruck, but still something that I think there's definitely a market for. And I think it could coexist with the Aptera. The Aptera could focus on the more repairability, CarPlay, high range market, and this vehicle could just focus on the more city driving, you know, people that want a really, really cheap form of transportation and they don't care so much about solar or having those high range numbers. This, I think, would be a really, really compelling product that I could even see myself buying one day in the future. I still run into situations where I feel like, oh man, it's just me and the wife in the car. We don't need to drive around this giant 4,000-pound vehicle. We don't need that whole second row. There's a lot of drives where it's just me and one other person, so for those types of drives, I feel like this would be so much cheaper to drive around and so much more efficient. So either scenario is exciting to me. I want to know what you guys think of these designs. Do you think these are totally going to be scrapped, or do you think there's some truth that maybe this is the kind of radical design which Franz referenced in the past as being his favorite? You know, there were interviews where they're like, what's your favorite design you've done? And he said, my favorite is one I can't talk about yet. Maybe this is the design he can't talk about yet. I love those doors, man. This like has gotten me so pumped, so excited for the next generation vehicle platform, and I really hope we get an unveiling next year at some point. But I could honestly envision a ton of Osborning going on if they do unveil something like that. And thank you once again to everybody supporting this channel. It really means a lot, and it helps make these videos possible. So thanks again, and have an excellent rest of your day.